Right now, somewhere in your family, there is a cousin you've never met. Maybe a second cousin. Maybe a third. A person who shares roughly 12% of your DNA, whose great-grandparent was the same person as yours, and whose face might look faintly familiar if you passed them on the street. You don't know their name. You've never thought about them, and the idea of marrying them would strike you as somewhere between strange and wrong. That instinct feels ancient, primal, like it's been in you since the beginning. It hasn't. Not in the way you think. Go back 300,000 years, a band of 30 people moving across what is now East Africa. A young man and woman, both members of the same group. They share grandparents. They've shared fires, hunts, everything. And no one in that band considered their union strange. There was no word for what they were doing. There was no rule against it. There was, as far as any evidence tells us, no concept yet of what incest even meant. Here's what most people assume. The taboo is biological, a built-in alarm system, something evolution wired directly into our brains to prevent genetic damage. We feel disgust, so it must be ancient, natural, hardwired from the start. That assumption was wrong. Very wrong. The disgust is real, but where it comes from and how old it actually is and what actually triggered it, that story is completely different from what you've been told. In 2004, evolutionary psychologist Deborah Lieberman at the University of Hawaii published a landmark study in the journal Nature. She had spent years trying to identify what actually triggers the incest avoidance response in human beings. Not cultural rules, not religious prohibition. The raw, visceral feeling of wrongness. And what she found was unexpected. It wasn't blood. It wasn't genetics. It wasn't some ancient instinct that recognized shared DNA. The trigger was co-residence during childhood, specifically the first years of life. If you lived in the same household as another child before you were 6 years old, your brain filed them into a category. Not romantic, not available. Something closer to immune. And it did this automatically, below the level of conscious thought. The mechanism even has a name now. The Westermarck effect, first described by Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermarck in 1891. Lieberman's study was the first to give it robust experimental confirmation. Here's the implication that most people miss. The Westermarck effect doesn't care about genetics. It cares about proximity. Raise two unrelated children together from birth and they will feel the same aversion toward each other as biological siblings. Separate biological siblings at birth, and they will feel no aversion at all. The brain is not detecting DNA. It is detecting shared early life. And it developed this way because, for most of human prehistory, the people you grew up with were your genetic relatives. Proximity was a reliable proxy. Good enough for 100,000 generations. Good enough. Until it wasn't. In 1975, archaeologist Maria Gimbutas and her colleagues were excavating a burial site at Sungir, in Russia, about 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow. The site dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, and inside they found something that changed the way researchers thought about ancient social structure. 3 individuals buried together, 2 of them children, with thousands of ivory beads, carved figurines, and red ochre. The grave goods were extraordinary, but what mattered more was the genetic analysis that came decades later. In 2017, a team led by paleogeneticist Eske Willerslev at the University of Cambridge ran ancient DNA analysis on the Sungir remains. What they found was this. These individuals showed almost no signs of inbreeding. For a group operating 34,000 years ago, in an Ice Age landscape that should have made genetic isolation inevitable, the Sungir people were not mating within their immediate family. They were maintaining exchange relationships with other bands. Deliberately. Systematically. The researchers compared their findings against a model of what would be expected if ancient humans had simply mated with whoever was available in their immediate group. The Sungir genome looked nothing like that. It looked like a community with a rule, an enforced boundary. Not a feeling, a structure. And here's the thing that changes the whole picture. A structure requires language. It requires the ability to say, not her, not him, that one from the other group, brought in through exchange. Someone had to be able to name the category of the forbidden, and someone had to be able to enforce it across generations. The incest taboo, the real, codified, enforced version, isn't older than language. It may be one of the things that required language to exist at all. Here's what nobody talks about. In 2007, anthropologist Joseph Henrich at the University of British Columbia published a paper examining the geographic distribution of incest prohibitions across 190 societies. He wasn't looking at whether they existed. They all did, in some form. He was looking at what they prohibited, and the variation was enormous. First cousin marriage is forbidden in most of Europe and North America. It is legal and common in much of the Middle East, South Asia, and large parts of Africa. In some societies, you are not only permitted, but expected to marry a specific category of cousin. Cross-cousin marriage, the child of your mother's brother or your father's sister, is the prescribed form in dozens of documented cultures. The Yanomami of the Amazon, certain Aboriginal Australian groups, various populations across sub-Saharan Africa. In those systems, marrying your cross-cousin isn't a violation of the taboo. It is the taboo. The boundary is drawn not around blood proximity, but around the patriline, or the matriline, a different architecture entirely, one that produces genetic outcomes not dramatically worse than stranger marriage, particularly in small populations where everyone is related at some level anyway. What Henrich's analysis showed was that there is no universal human incest taboo in the specific sense that word implies. There is a universal human capacity to generate one. But what gets placed inside the boundary and what gets left outside it is cultural, variable, and has been renegotiated by every society that has ever existed. The feeling is ancient. The rule is a technology, and like all technologies, it keeps getting redesigned. Think about this. Every human society ever documented has some form of incest restriction, not one exception in the ethnographic record. This is one of the closest things anthropology has to a universal law. But the specific content of that law varies so widely across cultures and eras that two people standing side by side, one from ancient Mesopotamia and one from contemporary North America, would disagree on almost every specific case while agreeing on the general principle. What does that mean? It means the brain supplies the capacity for prohibition, but not the content. It supplies the architecture for a rule, but not the rule. Every generation inherits the hardware and writes its own software, and no version of the software has ever been the same twice. The Westermarck effect is in you, right now. It's the reason your brother doesn't look like a romantic option, not because of DNA detection, not because of a genetic alarm, because you shared a house before you could form a memory of why it mattered. The brain encoded the boundary before you were old enough to understand what it was protecting. Your instinct feels ancient and absolute, and the feeling is real. But the line it's drawing, where exactly it falls, who counts as too close, which cousin is forbidden and which one is expected, that line was drawn by people long before you. In firelit camps and river crossings and the slow negotiation of which band's daughter went to which band's son. It is not nature, it is not culture, it is the most human thing there is. The place where those two can't be separated anymore.